part return and core return function inside of inventory. Specifically, as we're looking at our writer screen, on the left-hand side, I've got an icon there that says inventory. Again, if I click that, it's going to take me out into my inventory module. And again, the two icons that will be the primary focus of this morning's conversation are going to be my core return and my part return icons up here at the top in my inventory menu. However, before we get to those there are some configurable settings I want to take a look at that we're going to discuss in regards to those icons, as well as we need to talk about how things actually get into these windows. Meaning, if I looked at my core return window, I have an option to process my return, print a receipt, or cancel to close the window. We don't add items directly into either our core return and or our part return bank. They actually get fed through the daily course of events of not only buying parts, receiving parts, and selling them to consumers. That's how we're going to get information into these windows here. So before we get too deep onto the inventory side, I'm actually going to jump back over into our writer, and on the configuration screen, so if I go ahead and open up my configuration module, we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about a couple of different options or icons in here that are going to impact not only the way that part and core returns are handled at the point of sale, but also how they flow into the inventory module. I'm going to start out with underneath configuration. I'm going to go down to parts and then into the option for PO transfer and other parts options, almost all the way down here at the very bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on my parts, PO transfer and other parts options window, specifically as it relates to cores and or part returns. There's two settings. The first one is where we're going to flag and or establish our default core account. So when we go to post an AP transaction for a part that contains a core, the part's going to get posted into our inventory account. The core is going to go into our core account. So as we're looking at, let's say, a detail of expenses by account report, again, that core value going into that segregated account will help us isolate those values or those numbers over onto one side. The other piece is where it says create AP transaction when posting a purchase order. As we're going through and we're creating and or posting our receipts for the cores, we want to go ahead and we want to create that offsetting. In my case, I've got it set to always. As we go through and process our return, again, if I'm using accounts payable, we want to automatically have the system generate that offsetting AP transaction. I bought a part with a core, the part was $100, the core was $50. So in theory, at the moment I purchased that part from the vendor, I'm on the hook for $150 if I don't return that core. When I send the core back and therefore am given credit back for the $50 core that I've returned, I want to create that offsetting AP that says, well, now not $150, but now it's back to $100. But it's done as three separate transactions: the $100 part purchase, the $50 core, and then the offsetting $50 return. So again, in PO transfer and other parts options, specifically relevant to today's conversation, our core account, and then also create the AP transaction as we're posting our return and or our parts. Again, it says when posting PO, this setting does also impact PO management, but it'll also impact our part return and core return function as well. Hit the X in the upper right-hand corner underneath configuration. As we go to talk about part returns, I'm going to go under the configuration header, down to repair order, and then over to RO options. As I bring up this window here, the specific setting on the right-hand side, about halfway down, where it says edit INV number on add parts. Now that is unchecked, and we're going to leave it unchecked for the time being. If I'm utilizing accounts payable, again, I want that box to be unchecked. As it relates to part returns, we cannot flag a part as returned until we have at least entered in an invoice number. And again, if I'm using posting to accounts payable, we want to have the natural process of receiving and posting our accounts payable to enter in that invoice number. Come back and we'll take a look at that setting before our time is through. But again, as we're talking about part returns, what actually drives our ability to return a part is that we've told the system we've bought a part. Until we buy it, it doesn't allow us to tell the system that we're going to return it. As I continue on, underneath our configuration header, I'm going to go back to repair order. This time, I'm going to go down to catalog options. Now this one, specific to if you're using the Epicor catalog and or SmartyCat. That is, in this section here where it says Epicor options, the third option down says transfer core charge when posting. Essentially, as we're going through, again, in our example, we'll use what we call SmartyCat. If we grab a part that includes a core, should that core value get brought out of the catalog back over into our transaction and get associated with the part? So again, we make sure that we have that core to track not only through our return process, but all the way through our accounts payable as well. One last place in configuration, and we'll be back in and out of here on a couple of occasions through this morning's conversation, but under configuration down to parts and over to parts department groups. In here, as we come in, and I'm going to look at my break group just as an example. When I go in my break group, you'll notice my Fee 1 and Fee 2 say do not update. If I was to go down and I was going to look at my tire group, then as I looked at my tire group, you'll notice I've got my state tire fee and I've got my tire disposal fee. The same box, or Fee 1, is also used for our core charge. So if I have a department group configured to include fees, then the system will potentially overwrite our core charge. This is most applicable as it relates to batteries. And what I mean by that is there are certain states that have a battery disposal fee. Notice in my case, I don't have a Fee 1 and or a Fee 2 set up for batteries. If I said, well, you know what, my state actually charges or wants me to assess a state battery fee of $1, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add that into my configuration. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save that. And then when I go and look at my departments, I'm going to make sure that my battery department is included in that battery department group. Meaning, as I look through my list of my departments that's in my system, when I get down to batteries, I want to tell it that that belongs to my battery group. So therefore, those taxes and fees are going to get assessed to any part that gets assigned to this department. I'm going to click on Save, and I'm going to hit Cancel to close back out of there, because you're going to see the impact of this here in just a moment. I'm going to go over to our writer, and I'll pick on Dawn Smith down here at the bottom with her 2011 Chevy Malibu. We're going to go ahead and we're going to add a battery onto a transaction. So we're going to go up to Smart eJobs in the upper left-hand corner, and quite honestly, it doesn't matter whether we're using a catalog integration or we're just adding the part on through the Add Part icon. But in my case, we'll go through and we'll find a battery from one of our suppliers. We want to do it as an outside purchase and not from my stocking vendor. So let's grab one from CarQuest and then hit Next and drop that battery on the ticket. So we've got our battery that we've added onto our ticket, where if I was to go ahead and open that up, notice there is a $12 core charge that is associated with that battery. If I went to assign a department, and again in this case we're going to go down to my BTY batteries department, when I select that, notice it says you are about to change the core charge, or the department. The current core charge will be removed/updated. Do you wish to continue? When I answer yes to the question, my $12 core goes away. The only thing that we're now going to track is that we're charging that $1 state battery fee. If you have a fee that we're assessing to a part that potentially also has a core, what we want to do is we want to go in and we want to assess the fee as part of what we call Fee 2 as opposed to Fee 1. So in this case, we're actually going to change Fee 1, and I'm going to tell the system that we are not going to update Fee 1. However, Fee 2 is going to become that state battery fee, in this case $1, the charge to the consumer for that piece. If I clicked on Save, cancel one more time to close out of there, and then now let's go through the exact same exercise. We'll remove the battery job that we had added just a moment ago. Go back up to Smart eJobs in the upper left-hand corner. Again, the job's going to be Install Battery, and we'll grab the exact same battery that we did just a moment ago, in this case from CarQuest. So there's my battery. We'll hit Next in the upper right-hand corner. If I'm not sourcing book labor, hit Post and Exit. We've added that job back onto the ticket. When I double-click on the battery, there's my $12 core charge. When I come into my department and I tell the system that that belongs to my battery department, notice now we're going to track the $12 core charge and we're going to assess the $1 state battery fee. So as far as core charges are concerned, again, if you're going to assess a fee to a part that also potentially would contain a core charge, just make sure that that fee is assessed in the second, or what we call fee 2, as opposed to fee 1, where it would then potentially conflict with a core charge. I'm going to get out of my install battery job because we're going to go back to our conversation about part returns and core returns. So we're going to start out with cores. We're going to add a job onto a ticket. In this case, let's go ahead and let's add a job to remove and replace the calipers on this vehicle. While we're at it, we'll do the pads, the calipers, and the rotors. Don't need a hardware kit and or a wheel seal as we go through. So we're going to build this job, and again, sourcing parts from the catalog, my safety stop pads that I'll get from Napa, my premium rotors also we'll get from Napa. When it comes to my calipers, those are at the DC. So let's see what CarQuest has. How about a left and a right caliper that we'll get from CarQuest for that vehicle. 1 hour will be our labor time, and then we'll add 7/10 of an hour per side to replace the caliper, and then we'll post that back over to our transaction. So post and exit on the right-hand side. So we've added that part onto the ticket, much like we saw with the battery. When it comes to the calipers, we've got our $43 core charge associated, and by default, the system says that that core was received with sale. That also is a configurable option as to whether or not the system automatically flags this core received with sale box. If that box is not checked and I clicked on OK, then the core charge gets assessed to the consumer and it never goes into my core bank. So if the customer said, well, I want to keep my old calipers, well, that's perfectly fine, except there's a $43 core associated with those. If I can't send it back to the vendor, I'm going to have to charge you for it. However, by default, my system is configured to assume that the core has been received with the sale. And if you'll notice over here on the right-hand side, there's a little button there that says Process. There are two ways that something gets into our core return bank. The first way would be if we went through the process of finalizing this transaction for Dawn Smith, and there was a part of the transaction that was sold with a core charge of greater than $43, then the system dumps that into our core return bank just as part of the natural process of having gone through the sale. If I wanted to return the cores prior to finalizing the ticket, we're going to hang on to this car for a couple of days while we get this work done, and we're taking the calipers off today, I'd like to send them back, then the second way that something gets into our core return bank is through this button on the right-hand side that says Process. If I click on Process and then go ahead and click on OK, what you'll notice is if I went back over to the inventory module and pulled up my core return window, well, there's that caliper available for me to return before I've finalized the transaction. If I was to do the same with the other caliper, so I'll double click on the right caliper, hit Process, and then click OK. Again, same concept of it's going to go ahead and it's going to dump that into my core return bank. Now I've got both of those cores available to send back to my vendor. So we've got the cores that got into our core return bank, and again, it doesn't matter whether they get there by hitting the Process button or just through the process of finalizing the transaction. They end up in our core return bank. From there, we're now going to move over to, well, I actually want to send these cores back to my vendor to go ahead and record that I've received my offsetting credit. Now, before I do that, the other thing that we hadn't yet done is we actually hadn't posted my outside purchase transaction. I didn't even order these parts from my vendor. So before I actually want to process the return, I want to post my AP transaction. So we're first going to start out by recalling those, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to recall my right calipers as well. So then now what we'd see if we went back into our core return window is no longer are those available to return. So again, if I didn't actually end up with the dirty core eventually, I'd want to recall it out of my core return bank before I process the return to the vendor. Let's follow our transaction through for Dawn Smith. We've got approval to do the pads, the calipers, and the rotors. Over on the left-hand side, we're going to go ahead and we're going to send that order through Smart eOrder to both CarQuest to get the calipers and then to Napa to get the rotors and the pads. So again, we've submitted those orders electronically. In theory, the parts are on their way to us, where once they are received, then we're going to go up here to Post Accounts Payable, And again, if CarQuest has brought us the calipers, they've given us an invoice for those calipers, we've got an open account with CarQuest, and we'll post those to our repair order. There's my left caliper. If we want to go ahead and just record that it's a $58.99 cost with a $43 core, click OK, and then we'll do the same with the right caliper. Again, $58 cost, $43 core. Those are the only two parts that we ordered from our CarQuest vendor for this particular transaction. So we've now posted those into our accounts payable, and therefore we have flagged the parts as having been received. One other piece as far as these calipers are concerned, again, you'll notice that no department has been assigned to those. And if I go ahead and if I drop that down and I went ahead and said, well, let's assign that to the Department of Brake Caliper Remanufactured. When I select that, you'll notice, again, same exact message that we are about to change the department. The current core charge will be removed and or updated. Do you wish to continue? When I answer yes, well, therein disappears my core charge. I'm going to click on Cancel and go to Configuration again, because under Configuration, down to Parts, and then over to Parts Departments. Previously with the battery, I said, well, don't have a group where the fee is assessed to fee 1, which would potentially conflict with the core charge. The other piece is, don't have a department that's not associated with a specific group. Meaning, if I looked at my brake caliper remanufactured department, there is no group assigned to it. So basically it says, you know what, I don't know what the rules are when you assign something to this department. So if I told it that that belongs with my brake group, I'll click on Save, and my brake group is already flagged for both fee 1 and fee 2 to do not update. And then now when I came back through and did the exact same exercise, assigning that to my department for brake caliper remanufactured, again, notice now, no conflict. It does not ask me to overwrite my core charge because it knows that it should not update fee 1 and fee 2. We'll assign this to Bill Fosterman, answer yes to the question, and then in this case, we'll leave the pricing where it is. So I'll hit OK and say no to the question of adjusting the price. We'll assign this tech to all parts and labor on this repair order, and then now if we came in here and we said, well, let's go ahead and let's assign that same department, brake caliper remanufactured, again, no conflict because we've already gone in and made our adjustments to the department. So at this point, we've sent the order for the calipers to CarQuest. We have received the calipers along with their $43 core. We have posted our AP transaction for those calipers. And again, if we finalize this transaction, then the $43 core ends up in our core return bank. Our other option would be, again, we could go ahead and tell the system we're going to process that return after it tells us that we're selling the calipers just below our 60% minimum margin delta. Now that I've gone ahead and I've flagged those both by hitting process, if I was to go back over into the inventory module, look at my core return bank, again, there's those two cores from CarQuest. So whether we finalize the transaction or not, we can put those parts into our core return bank, and now we can handle the offsetting AP, meaning managing the return back to the vendor. I know I want to send these cores back to our friends at CarQuest. So up here at the top of the screen, it wants to know, well, which supplier are we sending these back to? And again, I'll hit the C key on the keyboard, which takes me down to CarQuest, where I've got 2 outstanding cores. I'm going to go ahead and send them both. If I had half a dozen and I'd already returned 2 or 3 and only had 3 or 4 to send back, I could select the individual lines. But in our case, both cores going back to CarQuest. Once I have them highlighted, I'm going to hit Process on the right-hand side, and it asks, do you wish to print a return receipt? My advice is always, I want to have some sort of physical verification that the CarQuest driver has taken $86 in cores. In this case, a lot of vendors will have some sort of core return slip. So when their driver shows up, or whomever the representative is, and they're going to take those dirty cores, they'll write that core return slip up and leave it with the shop, so that that's your shop, that's your verification that yes, they took, in this case, $86 worth of cores back to CarQuest. If I'm not getting that, then I'll probably print this core return piece, which then says we're going to acknowledge receipt of the cores that are listed below. In this case, 2 cores with a total dollar value of $86. So again, if I'm not going to get any other means by which I can track that core, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to print my core receipt. Asks, did the receipt print correctly? Again, we'll say yes to that question. We did get our hard copy document. And asks, would you like to process credit for the cores that we returned in this transaction? Typically, a core return is a two-step process. The guy that picks up the dirty cores is going to take them back to CarQuest, doesn't immediately hand me $86, or he doesn't immediately hand me a credit memo that indicates my account has been credited for that $86. So typically, he's going to have to take those cores back. Whoever's behind the counter is going to process the return. They'll give the driver a credit memo and say, hey, next time you go to Steve's Auto Repair, go ahead and just give him the credit memo so that he knows that he has been given credit back for those cores. So in this case, our answer is going to be no. We'll leave those in our outstanding core bank because we want to keep track until we get that credit memo, and then we'll clear them out of our dirty core bank. So what you'll notice is it's now populated the return date as well as it's assigned a PO number to that return. If I went back and looked at all suppliers, my visual cue is these two have not been processed as a return to the vendor. These two have been processed as the return to the vendor. I would say that if your vendor doesn't give you that hard copy or that written, say, core return document, and you're going to want to print the one that comes out of AutoWriter, my suggestion would be that you do that, let's say, once a day, either every night before you go home, every morning when you first walk in, because the vendor typically won't want to wait. If you say, oh, by the way, there's 2 cores back on the shelf, and wait a second while I go ahead and print up the paperwork and flag this as having been returned. So if you can have that paperwork already pre-printed, and then now all he has to do is just grab it, sign it, off he goes, and then that saves him time and makes his process more efficient as well. We're going to leave these cores where they are because, again, it takes a little bit of time for me to get that credit memo back from my vendor. We're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about part return for just a moment. So we'll come back and we'll process the credit for the return here in just a minute after we get our credit memo back from the vendor. But we've got core returns, and then we also have part returns. Now, part returns are a little bit different. We go back to our friend Dawn. As part of working on her vehicle, we happen to notice that the air filter, relatively dirty, about time to go ahead and get that thing changed, and we didn't have one in stock. We're going to go ahead and we're going to give her a shout and let her know that we want to do an air filter on her car. In this case, we'll grab one from Napa, go ahead and hit next in the upper right-hand corner, and then post that back onto the ticket. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to pre-order that, meaning even though I don't have the approval just yet, I'm assuming this won't be a hard sell. So let me go ahead and get that thing on order from Napa. So off my order goes to Napa. In theory, at some point in time, Napa is going to show up with 2 separate invoices, one for the pads and the rotors and one for that air filter. So we can go ahead and drop those onto our ticket for Dawn Smith. Now, with the air filter, what you'll notice is over on the right-hand side, there is a box there that says returned. That returned box is grayed out. I cannot tell the system that I have returned this part. And again, much like with the core, the reason being, well, I haven't actually received the part yet. So until I tell the system that I've received the part, I can't actually return it. We're going to go through this 2 different ways, meaning we've received the air filter. We'll go up to post accounts payable. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tell the system that I got that from Napa, and here was Napa's invoice for that. Goes on to a repair order for Dawn Smith, and that's the air filter that we got back. If I knew my tech, I could assign it now, and or not necessarily imperative at this point, but that's the only part that came from Napa on this invoice. Again, we've got a couple of more parts heading our way, the pads and the rotors. We'll post that into accounts payable, and then now that we've told the system we have received the part, if I double click on that air filter, notice now that box is available where it says returned. If Dawn said, you know what, appreciate the fact that you're recommending the air filter, but you know what, my husband will grab one from the local parts store and drop it in for us, save us a few bucks as far as that's concerned. So if they're not going to have that work performed, then I could come in and I could flag that as returned. Again, once we've told the system that we've bought the part, then now we can tell the system we are returning the part. And the exact same concept as a core return, and that is, well, I'd like to process this return prior to actually finalizing the transaction. If I do nothing else but just flag it as returned and close out of my transaction, the system will then include it in my part return bank. However, if I'd like to send it back right now, as opposed to waiting until the invoice is finalized, I can also process and dump that into my part return bank. Again, I'll click on OK. So as I come in here, notice now it's flagged as returned, and any part that's flagged as returned gets suppressed from printing on a customer document. Meaning, if I hit print RO, even though this is still assigned to the ticket for Dawn Smith and will be forever, so we can always know we bought that part, if I hit print RO, nowhere on the printed document that we're going to get out of the system will it actually display that we've got that their filter was ever associated. So again, even though the labor job is still there, the part itself no longer associated. And if I went ahead and declined the labor, then now I wouldn't have the labor job there listed as an item we performed as well. You'll notice my part return is still lit up in red, and that's because down at the very bottom, there's a drop-down box that says Why Returned. If we're looking back on the configuration side, under the configuration settings, we're going down to Parts, and then down here where it says Reasons for Return. So if I wanted to keep track of, well, not only who did we send it back to, but why, we can go ahead and we can enter in our reasons for return. Not too much to configuring this window. It's simply a matter of establishing an abbreviation, we'll call it the reason code, and the reason, again, what's going to actually show up in the drop-down box and or on reports that we look at as far as what was returned. So again, we can establish a reason for return as well as underneath configuration, repair order, and then in this case required entries. If I'm looking underneath the parts section, there's also an option here that says warn if no reason for return. So I've got that set to require, so therefore if I flag a part as returned, before I can finalize the transaction, I've got to establish on that part record what was the reason for having returned that to the vendor. The X in the upper right hand corner, because while we're in here, I'm going to go back and I'm going to change a configuration setting, specifically the one under repair order and over to RO options, where my option was to edit INV number on add parts. If I click that box and then click on OK, then I'm going to go ahead and close out of ROWriter and allow it to reopen, because in order for me to see that change happen, I've got to actually close the program and reopen. Now that box that I just checked essentially is determining whether or not we're going to be forced to enter an AP transaction or not. Meaning not every shop uses accounts payable, it's just not the right solution for them, and that's perfectly okay. However, if I have that box unchecked, what you'll notice is where it says brake pads, over here on the right hand side, as opposed to the button saying post to AP, the system now is asking us for an invoice number. Same holds true for the rotors. So if I came in here and I said, well, the invoice number for those, when I bought them from Napa, was NAP 124. Once I have now entered a value into that box, now I can flag it as having been returned. In this case, by checking the configuration setting, we're essentially saying, I'm not forcing posting into accounts payable, but I'd still like to track the return. So therefore, into that box, the vendor invoice number, and then now I can go ahead and flag a part as having been returned again. So that setting matters not only to posting accounts payable, but if I'm looking at using the part return functionality, that's ultimately the box that needs to get filled in order for the part return functionality to become available. Same concept of actually sending the part back. So if it's in our part return bank, all we do is we select the part, we define the supplier first, we tell it we're sending it back to Napa, and again in this case I just double clicked on the line to go ahead and put my check mark there. Hit process. Would we like to print the return receipt? Same exact receipt as we'd see on the core return side. And again, if I'm not getting some other physical validation from my supplier that they've taken that part from me, I would print that and include that with my return. And then again, it asks, would we like to process credit for the cores or for the parts that we returned in this transaction? Same concept here of I'm giving the part back to my parts house. I want to wait until I get my credit memo or my verification that they've credited my account before we actually process the credit. So 2 steps, we'll send it back first, and then when we get our verification, now we'll go ahead and actually process the offsetting AP transaction. I'll hit the X in the upper right-hand corner to close out of my part return bank. There is one last piece as far as when we talk about getting parts in and out of those windows, and that is, what about returning a part with a core? Meaning, if we go up to where it says Smart eJobs, and in this window here, we've also noticed that, almost time to replace the starter on Dawn's 2011 Chevy Malibu. We'll build the job, including the labor time, and then as we look at our starters that are available, we've got a remanufactured from Napa with a $50 core. Pardon me. We'll post that onto our transaction, and then let's go ahead and let's submit the order to go ahead and have that starter brought over from our friends at Napa. Much like we've done before, post and exit will get me out of there. Much like we've done before, we're going to post our AP transaction. Let me go ahead and turn my setting back on. That'll force me to do that. So unchecking my box, clicking OK, and then closing out of my RO Writer in order to go ahead and have the system reset and or recognize the change we've made to configuration. So as we come back in and we're looking now at our transaction for Dawn Smith, as we pull up Dawn, and then down there at the bottom is the starter we've just ordered. Let's post it, and let's tell the system that Napa's arrived and brought us that starter. So again, we're going to find our transaction for Dawn Smith. There's my starter. There's my $50 core along with my $121.48 cost, posting that, and we won't adjust the selling price based on where it's at cost and sell. So we posted our AP transaction for that starter, and there it is. It shows that it was NAP125 was my vendor invoice number, and there was a $50 core along with $121.48 charge for the part. And notice, even though we've posted our AP transaction, I still cannot flag that as returned. That's because by default, it wants to assume that that dirty core is going into our core return bank. If I want to return a part that includes a core charge, all I have to do is uncheck the box that says core received with sale. Because basically what we're saying is we're going to send this part back to the vendor, and therefore we are not going to put a $50 dirty core into our core bank. Now we can flag it as returned, and much like we saw before, if I wanted, I could process that into my return bank, and then now if we went over into inventory and looked at my part return bank, there's both my starter, the $121.48 cost, along with the $50 core. So again, in this case, when we go and post our credit for this, we'll reverse not only the $121.48 I paid for the starter, but the $50 that I paid for the core as well. So we're reversing the entirety of that transaction. We don't want to wipe out the core charge, because when we posted it into accounts payable, we told it $121.50. We want to just tell the system we're not putting that core into our dirty core bank. So therefore, uncheck the core received with sale box, and then I can flag it as returned. A couple last things as we finish up this topic. We're going to go ahead and hit the X, because I did get my credit memo back for those 2 cores that we sent back to CarQuest. So again, as I come back in here, step 2 is we're going to find our supplier. We'll go ahead and we'll flag both parts. And now when I hit process, again, what you'll notice is it doesn't ask me to print the return receipt. It says, well, on that return from CarQuest, there should have been an invoice number. There's a $0 posting going back into accounts payable for this transaction, but a negative $86 offsetting transaction going into my core account. So again, we'll post that in. If I'd like, I can print a receipt that shows and or gives me the AP detail of that $86 posting into my core account. I'll answer no to that question, and now we're just back over at our core return bank, where again, if I was to look, those parts from CarQuest no longer appear because they're no longer outstanding. We've both told the system we sent them back to the vendor, and then again, we've received our offsetting credit memo, so therefore I'm not waiting for verification that those monies were returned to me. Same would hold true with the part return. Again, if that air filter, that credit memo came back, again, in this case, Napa is my supplier, as opposed to selecting both parts, just that one, the air filter, we'll process that, and again, put in my offsetting invoice number on the return, In this case, $869 to my inventory account, $0 to my core. And again, if we'd like to, we could print that AP detail receipt showing those parts have gone into my, that offsetting AP transaction has now been recorded. One last piece as far as parts returns are concerned, and that is the only difference between these two windows is this little button in the lower left-hand corner that says Post to Inventory. If I looked at my core return window, again, Post to Inventory is grayed out, and that's because it's a dirty core, it's not actually saleable inventory, meaning I don't actually have something I could theoretically sell. But with a part return, well, this is a brand new item, which in theory I could use for another vehicle. So if I'm not sending it back to my vendor, then I want to post it into my inventory. I have two sets of brake pads up there, an MKD 468V. If I went and looked and I said, well, I want to add an MKD 468V onto a transaction, the system says, I don't know what that part is. That's not currently part of your standard stocking assortment. But if I was to come back in here and say, well, those actually came from AutoZone. So from my list of suppliers, I'll find AutoZone, and we're going to select them all, and then I'll hit Post to Inventory. Then the system says, first off, I've got to have the appropriate security level. And it tells me we're about to either adjust on hand or create a new part record in my inventory. Do I wish to continue? I'm going to say yes to that question. And it says, well, essentially what we're doing when we're creating that is we're doing an inventory adjustment. In this case, it was an order overage on the case of both of those sets of pads. And then now they disappear from my part return bank. But if I went back in and did the exact same thing I did just a moment ago, so I said it was an MKD 468V part number, now it says, well, I know what that part is. I've created the record with the line code and the description that we had associated with the part. And 2, because that was how many we flagged as getting posted into our inventory, becomes our on-hand quantity. So again, the only difference between the two windows is that little icon in the lower left-hand corner that says Post to Inventory. Last piece before we finish our conversation this morning is there are some reports that will talk about the taxes and cores. In this case, our part receipt report down here at the, part return report down here at the bottom will give us information about parts that have been flagged as returns. So if I want to go ahead and see what those are, there's a core report. So again, if I'd like to see what's in my outstanding core window and or when something was sent back. In this case, if I just looked at activity for today on my core report, when that thing comes up on the screen, it'll tell me that here are the two parts that we had for the core. The invoice is open. They were a non-stock item. We sent them back to CarQuest on this invoice. So again, $86 in cores that have been returned, nothing outstanding from our friends at CarQuest. So again, your core report and also your part returned report would be your two items I'd point you towards in order to keep track of this and this. Hit the X in the upper right-hand corner to close out of my inventory module.